Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Wednesday seminar held by the Institute of Chinese Studies. Today's subject focuses on India-Taiwan economic ties. And the question we seek to answer is right now the right time? As you know, Taiwan is a very dynamic economy and has been so for the more than the last 50 to 60 years. In fact, Taiwan, along with Singapore and Hong Kong, constitute what are known as the Little Tigers, where the East Asian miracle, as it is now known, took off. That is the economic revival of that region of the world, which was pioneered by these three very small economic units, and then rapidly spread to Japan, South Korea, and then to the People's Republic of China, and ultimately, of course, to the ASEAN and other regions. So Taiwan has a history of economic dynamism, and it is therefore very natural at this time for India in particular to see what are the opportunities in India-Taiwan economic relations, and as to whether India's particular needs for technology, for industrial development at this time can be served by exploring the potential that Taiwan offers in many dimensions. And to discuss this today, we have three very distinguished panelists. I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak. The first is Dr. Muman Chun, who is the Deputy Representative of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Center. He is a distinguished professor of Chongqing University. He has an excellent academic record. Before that, he is also the Taiwan South Asia Studies Association chairman, and he has written widely about South Asia and India. I won't go into the other details. The earlier sheet about this event carries his biodata. Welcome, Dr. Chen. Second panelist is Dr. Joe Thomas Karackattu. He teaches Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Earlier, he's been fellow at Yale University and at the India-China Institute in New York, and very keenly interested in the political economies and other dimensions of relationships between India and that region of the world. And our third speaker will be Mr. Santosh Pai, who is Treasurer and Honorary Fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies. He is a lawyer qualified both in Indian law and Chinese law, which is, I think, quite a rare combination. And he brings a depth of knowledge in terms of the practical relationships between commerce and industry of each country, and the intricacies, the problems, as well as the opportunities on the ground. So I think we will be able to, with this distinguished panel, to cover a fair gamut that lies ahead in what is possible between India and Taiwan at this juncture. Now, we will conduct this discussion on the following basis. We will first ask each of the panelists in this order to make a presentation, not exceeding 10 minutes. And after that, I will ask each of them one question, for which they will have another 3 minutes. And all that, together with my present introduction, should take us to a total of about 45 minutes. And the rest of the time will be Q&A from the floor, which will give the panelists another opportunity to cover some areas which they may have missed whilst answering the questions. And before I turn to Dr. Chen, just to remind the audience that there is a chat box and there is a raise hand option. So you can either type your questions in the chat box or raise your hand, and we'll call upon you for your questions. So now, without further ado, let me invite you, Dr. Chen, to make your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And friends and scholars in India and elsewhere, I'm very, very glad to be here today and to share with you my observations about India-Taiwan economic relations. I remember last time I talked at ICS was 4 years ago. It was right after Taiwan got elected to new president of Taiwan. And then I came to Delhi. I visited various think tanks and also gave a talk about the forthcoming Southbound policy, new Southbound policy of Taiwan. And I still remember that the talk. And today, my presentation will just give you some very general ideas about the current situation, India-Taiwan. And I do prepare a few to see the figures and also the situation. First, let me talk a little bit about Taiwan. Taiwan's economic strength. How big is Taiwan? So you can see the slide. Can you?
Yes.
Okay. Good. Yeah. Okay. Here I make a chart with a comparison between Taiwan and India. So you can see the population, Taiwan versus India. In terms of population, Taiwan is only like 1.7% of the population in India. Probably the size is like Haryana, the state of Haryana. In terms of the GDP, of course, India is much bigger, 2.5 trillion, and Taiwan is 635 billion. Yeah, but you see, because of the Taiwan is much smaller, so that Taiwan's GDP is like even still like 1/4 of the India, but still very big. Yeah, so in our GDP ranking by in the world is 21, and India is 6. And then we look at the trade. The figure I use is 2019, and you see that Taiwan's overall trade is $614 billion US dollars, and India is bigger than Taiwan. That's for sure, because India is a larger economy. And but if you look at the export, Taiwan's export is 329 billion US dollars in 2019. It's actually higher than India's export. Yeah, so by different standards, you will see that Taiwan is a big economic power, yeah, compared to most countries in the world. And so when we talk about Taiwan and India, it is very natural for us to talk about economic relations. And many of you know that Taiwan and India start setting up representative office in 1995. In the past 25 years, we have office here in Delhi called TECC, and the Indian government also have representative office in Taipei called ITA. Yeah, and but because of the various reasons, so that political relations does not have much progress as we expected. But when we talk about economic, Taiwan is a trading state. Yeah, and India is also a big number of international of the world economy. So it is natural for both sides to think that we should have more economic cooperation. We should have more trade, and then political cooperation, political dialogue could follow. Yeah, so that's why that many people in Taiwan and in India think that the economic relations are the most important. And but what's the situation? What's the trade and the investment between Taiwan and India? I give you some numbers. Bilateral trade. You see this slide. Bilateral trade reached $7.05 billion in 2018. That is the highest amount we ever achieved. Of course, Taiwan still enjoy about 5 million of surplus, but the number dropped to less than 5 billion last year. Yeah. And because of the COVID-19 crisis, all countries and international trade are also affected. And this amount still make India number 15 as Taiwan's trade partner. But the share is much less. In 2018, the share of Taiwan-India trade to Taiwan's overall international trade is 1.1%. But last year, it dropped into 0.76%. So this is the trade. And in terms of the investments, that Taiwanese investment in India, according to Taiwanese government figures, is in the past 20, 30 years is about $1 billion US. If you check the Indian government number, the number is smaller. Yeah, but this number usually do not include the Taiwanese companies who came to India from a third country, like from Thailand, from Singapore, from Hong Kong. If all these numbers are included, then probably I think that the investment probably reached $2 billion US. So this is a trade and investment. And let me give you a little bit more detail about the investment side. Most Taiwanese investments in India focus on ICT, auto parts, and shoemaking. And so actually it covers a lot of different industries. Yeah, and I particularly want to say this shoemaking. Actually, the biggest Taiwanese company making shoes in India, the company name is called Apache. Apache is the major supplier of Adidas. So actually the Adidas shoes around the world actually are made by Apaches and made here in India, in South India. Yeah, about 20 years ago, when a lot of Taiwanese company went to China, went to Vietnam to start business, this company came to India. And they've been doing very good. But right now, the largest sector of Taiwanese investments in India is a mobile phone. I'm sorry, I missed the word phone. Mobile phone assembly. Almost all major Apple suppliers, including Foxconn, and Riley-Star is also a Foxconn, part of Foxconn company. Wistron and Pegatron. They all have shifted to India under Perhaps you remember PLI, Production Linked Incentive Scheme, launched by the Indian government in previous years. And among all these investments, Foxconn is still the largest single investor. They claim to have invested in India for about $1 billion US. Yeah, and the Taiwanese government, state-owned companies in Taiwan, the largest single investor is we call China Steel in Gujarat. It's a Taiwanese state-owned company. Yeah. So this is the major investors. Okay, let me stop this. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit more about other issues. That is, right now, the amount of the trade and investments, if you compare to Taiwan's trade with China, or Taiwan's investment in other countries like Vietnam, the number is very small. And particularly when we talk about, because here in India, many Taiwanese, many Taiwanese companies, that they have invested a lot in China and in Southeast Asian countries before. And how many companies are actually in India? This number compared to their investment in China and other countries is very small. I think right now only about 200 Taiwanese companies are investing in India. And in China alone, about 100,000 Taiwanese companies are operating there. And the number of citizens in India, working in India, or doing the trade or doing the business related to India is probably less than 1,000, compared to almost 1 million Taiwanese, or more than 300,000 1 million Taiwanese living in China, and 300,000 Taiwanese living in Vietnam. Yeah. So why that the Taiwanese investment or Taiwan-India trade is still the number could not become big, and there are several. So it will be difficult for them to come to India alone, and they could go to China or go to other Southeast Asian countries in clusters. So it will be easier for them to go in groups and set up the supply chain. And another reason is that the Taiwan and India, our culture are quite different. So it will be difficult for Taiwanese to really know how to run business over here. And of course, there are also political barriers. Right now, we do not have a free trade agreement, and we have talked about signing a free trade agreement. But in recent years, it seems that neither Indian government nor Taiwanese government has a very strong incentive to continue. Okay, because I already talked for 10 minutes, so I would like to stop here. I'd like to probably have more time talking about these issues later in the seminar. Okay?
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen, for this very succinct presentation and for sticking to your time slot. Yes, I think you will get opportunities to expand on the very valuable points you have made. Now, let me turn to Dr. Joe Thomas Karackattu. Please.
Thank you, sir, and good afternoon to everyone here. I think it's important to understand that the India-Taiwan bilateral relationship, it belies the extraordinary position that both India and Taiwan enjoy in world economic affairs. India is a standout growth story, particularly in the post-2008 financial crisis period. And Taiwan is one of the cradles of high technology manufacturing. The title for today's event was, "Is this the right time?" I would say there's never been a better time. The reason is the context that we find ourselves in. And what is this context? we are increasingly looking at a kind of geopolitics that is fueling technological rivalry, particularly between the United States and China. And this has sort of come down to proportions where it almost seems that the technological race is become similar to some kind of a technological arms race. In Chinese companies like Huawei, like ZTE, and whether for reasons fictional or not, but this lack of trust in Chinese companies is unlikely to abate anytime soon. The world that we find ourselves in, I'm sure you would agree that the component of technology in our lives is only going to increase, even with things that we don't fully understand. So, for example, we might be familiar with setting up auto debit instructions on our cards to pay our utilities, but we are looking at a time period that increasingly will have gadgets or equipments communicating among themselves. So, for instance, your gas terminal might then be auto-communicating with your bank to generate the month's invoice and pay, for instance, or the medical or the health app that you use on your phone might be communicating with your pharmacy for replenishing your monthly medicines, for instance. Or even your urban space. I mean, your urban space would be changing in terms of new designs to accommodate all of this technological change. So this is increasingly the outlook that we have for the foreseeable future. And COVID-19, mind you, I mean, although there was some kind of an abrupt stoppage of production, an abrupt stoppage of economic activity briefly as a result of COVID-19. But what is ironic is that, and I was going through reports which actually show that ever since we are dealing with COVID-19, there's been a very acute shortage of semiconductors or integrated circuits. And the reason is very obvious. A lot of us have started to use more technology, whether it is at home, the food that you order, whether it is working from home, has followed. It's ironic that for many of these products, especially semiconductors, there's been an acute shortage. And this kind of shortage is actually being mopped up. If you look at the main players in the market, this is being mopped up by technological giants like the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation or Samsung Electronics, and even Chinese companies that increasingly rely on these chips from these manufacturers are seen to have been importing more of chips than less. So this is the context I wanted to lay out in terms of whether it's a good time or not. There's never been a better time. But have we been satisfactorily pursuing this dyadic relationship between India and Taiwan? And here I thought it might be to look at some of the trends in the bilateral relations. So if you give me a moment, I'd like to put up some numbers. Yeah. So if you look at the trade statistics, and I think Mumin had shared a comprehensive slide which had the overall trade figures. And you're looking at trade numbers between 7 and 8 billion as far as bilateral trade is concerned. And in terms of overall trend, if you look at the overall trend, let me just zoom into this. Now, if you look at the year-wise trends, the 2019 numbers, if you could just look at the 2019 numbers or even the 2018 numbers, they are roughly slightly lower than the bilateral trade that we had around 2011, for instance. And I'm looking at a 10-year time period, and this data is collated, of course, from the Taiwanese Bureau of Foreign Trade. And it's very obvious that the overall trend for bilateral trade, it actually shows some kind of a decline from 2011, 12, it picks up. And if you look at the trade composition, again, the trade composition remains slightly lopsided. Indian exports comprise mineral fuels, mineral oils, iron and steel, organic chemicals, cotton. And if you look at what we import from Taiwan, these are basically higher value-added products. So you're looking at electrical machinery, you're looking at equipment, you're looking at appliances, and so on. Again, although we have an Act East policy in place, which allowed us to upgrade our relations to some kind of a strategic partnership with countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, ASEAN. And although we've made an effort, at least in terms of intent, to forge closer ties with all the countries in the Asia-Pacific region, the scope and geographic reach of the Act East policy, although enlarged, definitely does not list Taiwan as far as the strategic dimension of the relationship is concerned. That is not listed in the ambit of the Act East policy. If you look at how India fares, and I'll sort of share another useful graph here. India was only ranked around 15, as Mumin was pointing out, as far as being Taiwan's trade partner. Of course, the trade relationship is heavily dwarfed as far as mainland China is concerned. Compared to India, if you look at the trade between China and Taiwan, that's nearly in the band of 180 to 200 billion, right? I mean, that's roughly the band. And now, of late, we've seen that under Tsai Ing-wen, we have a new Southbound policy, which is more people-centered. It calls for more people-to-people exchanges, particularly with countries in Southeast Asia, Oceania. And this strategy, although it sort of presents a huge economic opportunity for Taiwan, it represents merchandise trade of about 100 billion. The fact of the matter is that India is yet to benefit in any concrete terms as far as even the effect of the new Southbound policy is concerned. So I'd like to just bring to your attention the main beneficiaries of the new Southbound policy. And again, this is data that I've collated for a 10-year period. Now, overall, it's evident that, as even Mumin was mentioning, apart from China, bulk of the investment that goes, if you're looking at specifically the area that is addressed by the new Southbound policy, this investment has largely flown to countries like Vietnam, for instance. They get a huge chunk of about 30 billion plus. I mean, India gets 1 billion earlier, but you're looking at about 1 billion overall, whereas Vietnam would be getting over 30 billion and Indonesia would be getting about 17 to 18 billion and Thailand would be getting about 15 to 16 billion. So this certainly pales in comparison to, in terms of accumulated investments, there is still a long way to go. I feel which has a specific India focus. The idea is to form an economic community. So I think the deliverables should be identified, especially for a partner like India. And I think the deliverables should be reviewed annually, every year, because there is a need to fix accountability as far as what is it that the progress that we have made. I also feel that a lot of energy in India-Taiwan relations is spent on overemphasizing government-to-government relations. Whereas that should be avoided, and we need to achieve more critical mass, multi-level engagement, targeting businesses and people-to-people exchanges. In terms of the next slide that I have, yes, these are broadly the areas I felt that India and Taiwan should come closer in a South Asian Silicon Valley. I mean, based on the strengths that we discussed, particularly for Taiwan, this is also something which is doable, particularly given the fact that India has targets for electronics manufacturing that are not being met through domestic manufacturing. We still depend a lot on imports. This is an area where Taiwan can contribute in very concrete terms. We need to have more people-to-people exchanges. If you look at the number of student exchanges, these are in the range of 2,000 to 3,000. That is hardly the kind of critical mass that will allow friends to develop in both countries. Similarly, if you look at Taiwanese businesses, I think Mumin pointed out the number of business persons in India compared to Vietnam as well as in China. And that itself is a reflection of the fact that based on a lot of interviews I've had with the Taishangren, Taiwanese businessmen who've invested in China, they've always felt that there are issues relating to language, culture. The Taishan can educate their kids in Taishan-run schools, whereas that becomes an issue here. Till recently, they had issues with standardization of taxation, but hopefully with the GST, some of those might abate in the coming years. But broadly, these were some of the challenges that were identified. I'd also like to suggest that the policy towards Taiwan, particularly for countries like India or even the United States, will be a tricky one. It will always oscillate between the one China policy that gets interpreted as one China, two governments, and also an interpretation of soft balancing. We definitely need to create some kind of a new normal relationship with Taiwan. And depending on the transactional imperatives that arise while dealing with China. Now, again, a strategy in India that aims to treat Taiwan as some kind of China's soft underbelly, it doesn't have much longevity as far as a policy is concerned. Such a strategy doesn't require much imagination. It would, in fact, run counter to our own development, long-term development goals. We need to maintain that kind of balance because China is good at big projects, high-speed rail, dams, power plants. And Taiwan's strengths, as Mumin was mentioning, are really the strengths of its small and medium-sized enterprises, whether it is ICT or whether it is agriculture. So for this reason, it's important also for Taiwan, specifically in order to sign bilateral framework agreements with its trade partners. I think that sort of an approach might be the least problematic approach. And I say this also based on core political attitudes in Taiwan. If I have time, I would like to go through some of the core political attitudes and how they have changed in Taiwan. But if I have exceeded my time now, I'll reserve it for the next Q&A segment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. I think you have touched on some very key points, and we will come back to those areas later on. I assure you about that. Now, let me move to Santosh, our third and final speaker, for his presentation. Over to you, Santosh.
Thank you, Ravi, and hello to everyone. I think I have the advantage of coming last because both Dr. Chen and Dr. Joe's presentations have provided all the required raw material in terms of data and ideas that come into play while we discuss this topic. So it really falls upon me to just highlight, I'll try to make 4 or 5 points. From a practitioner's perspective, as wearing the hat of industry, trying to survey this landscape from a Taiwanese investor's perspective, because when we're talking about strengthening ties, what India is really looking for is investment from Taiwan. And from Taiwan's side, as Dr. Chen pointed out, there is hope of much more robust growth in terms of trade, in terms of sustained growth. So let me start. The first point, I think, from a policy, I'll divide my interventions into 2 categories. One is at the policy level. So in the first round of 10 minutes, I will only stick to policy level bottlenecks or challenges or things to do. And in the second round, if I get a chance, I will also dwell upon some practical case studies or experiences that have really occurred in the last few years. So at the policy level, I think the new Southbound policy on the Taiwanese side, and also a plethora of policies on the India side, starting from the national electronics policy, the production-linked incentives, the Atmanirbharta mission, and so on, Make in India. So all these are in one way or the other signaling India's intention to welcome the type of investments that Taiwanese industry can offer in core technologies, in electronic products, which are higher up the value chain rather than low-level assembly and so on. But for one reason or the other, the investment levels have not really reached their full potential. And here I would like to point out that most FDI across the world follows trade. So if there is sustained trade growth for a number of years, that gives confidence to the FDI investing country to go to a recipient country and say that I have been trading with this country for so long that there is sustained growth and demand. So I will take a plunge and invest. And this is exactly what India has seen with China. India-China trade grew for almost 10, 15 years before investment really took off. So from this perspective, I think we are far behind the curve. Whatever little trade is there has been not growing sustainably. So that itself raises a question mark. Now, very recently, I was privy to a very nicely articulated view from an Indian think tank or policy sort of advisor, saying that India has now decided to move away from a trade-led investment attraction model, and we are now going into a erecting barriers for trade and then sort of compelling foreign investors to make investment. Now, academically, it is very attractive. It's a unique model. But from a practical perspective, this is something that it's very difficult to sell. It's a very tough sell indeed. And in the last 1 year, all the uncertainty that we have seen with Chinese investments and trade with China, one of the part of the audience which is very worried is Taiwanese companies, because if a Taiwanese company invests and sets up a factory in India, they have 10 other factories in China which will feed into the supply chain, and they will have to rely on production in China to feed the input materials for their factories in India. And if India-China tensions are uncertain, trade ties are uncertain and fraught with tensions, that brings up a lot of uncertainty. So this is one idea I wanted to explain here and say, when the decision maker looks at the Indian investment landscape, this is one idea. The second one is India's foreign trade policy. I think until 2019, late 2019, Taiwan industry was hoping that India will somehow make up its mind and join RCEP. Because for Taiwanese industry, this would have meant a very large area to distribute their investments and supply chain in. They have already, because of the US-China trade war, decided to diversify away from China. But in 2019, they were still at the junction of making up mind on Vietnam and ASEAN countries or India. But after India signaled this intention to stay away from RCEP, this has again jolted the confidence of Taiwanese investors, saying that if we put our investment in India, how will we sustain that? I mean, not from a profitability perspective, but from a practical supply chain perspective, how will we integrate our investment in India with the rest of the supply chain across ASEAN? And similarly, on the foreign trade policy, apart from RCEP, even before that, India's FTA with ASEAN countries is not really utilized in a very, to its full potential. So this is also worrisome. And so India, while its decision to stay away from RCEP is fine, it should make a compensatory outreach to Taiwanese industry and address their concerns and saying that we know this has impacted your sentiment and we will take other measures to make up for it. So, that is the only way it will work. I mean, there's no right and wrong answer, but we have to compensate for it somewhere else. Now, my third idea that I want to present here is it's India's own domestic FDI policy. I've written about it in January 2 months ago, that India's FDI policy is really not friendly towards SMEs. And 95% of Taiwanese industry are composed of SMEs. And why do I say that? Because if you look at any state-level industrial policy, there's a skew towards attracting large-scale investments. Now, when you say large-scale, either in terms of capital or employment generation, we have a few contract manufacturers, which Dr. Chen mentioned, Foxconn, Winstron, and those, they have taken the bait and they've come to India. So they have responded to India's Make in India call and they've come. But really to go into the next 100 or 200, 500 Taiwanese companies, we need to focus more on what they are looking for. And they are looking at maybe starting small, coming in with a niche product or a niche technology, starting up a small factory somewhere, and getting uninterrupted power, workforce, support from the government to ensure sustained growth and expansion. And unfortunately, none of our policy incentives take care of this sustained expansion, because even investors who might have made an aggressive push into India, not from Taiwan, but from other countries, really struggle to expand beyond the critical mass. And the critical mass is quite low. It could be 100 workers or 200 workers because they face various bottlenecks. So this FDI policy remains a big challenge for Taiwanese companies. There are ways to overcome it. I have spoken in other fora about how to overcome them. One is, of course, the cluster model, which Dr. Chen mentioned. But India's own experience in promoting these cluster parks, whether for Japanese or Chinese, has not been really successful for various reasons. Because you can't have multiple sectors focused in one area. It's not efficient enough. If you focus on a single sector, you need a critical mass of 30, 40 companies for an industrial park to take off, and that takes a long time. If you have 2 or 3 companies which are willing to invest, ambitious project like an industrial park takes a number of years to develop. So it is, upon both sides at the industry level to explore other models. Now, I'll touch upon my last idea here. What are the other models? One model is you combine Taiwanese companies as part of a supply chain. And instead of giving incentives to at the company level, you look at it as a component or a segment, whether it's automobile or a mobile phone or something. You say that 2 or 3 companies which come to India as part of a supply chain, we will give them incentives as a group. Rather than looking at individual sizes, we will say that collectively they will make so much investment. So collectively, we will give them an incentive. This will solve both the problems. We will solve the problem of Indian FDI policy not addressing SMEs and these cluster parks, falling short of critical mass. The second idea is JVs. Recently, the Tata Group announced a major investment for a mobile phone factory. There might be other industrial groups in India. So they can really, do some kind of detailed, in-depth matchmaking and select Taiwanese suppliers, because Taiwanese suppliers are very good at coming and establishing a factory if they have assured custom or a customer for next 5 to 6 years. They will make the willing investment. So it's not really a case of capital deficiency, but it's a lack of certainty that keeps them away from India. The third idea, which might be a little more difficult, is to take technology. And when I say technology, I'm not talking about semiconductors. Although we might like to have semiconductor facilities in India, that's a long way away. But we can start small, some technology which is really important for India from a cost perspective. We can license it and demonstrate to the Taiwanese industry that there are Indian companies which can use this technology, and the Taiwanese companies can benefit in terms of royalty and so on. So this is a little bit of out-of-the-box thinking. Now, before I end, the last point I would like to make is, because I feel that in the press and amongst a lot of people who are not close to industry, there is a feeling that anti-China backlash automatically is good for Taiwan. This is not really true. It is very difficult to make a case before an investor or a businessman saying that you're from Taiwan and now we have had some problems with China, so therefore you must feel welcome. I mean, at a political level, that's okay. It might make for an environment where we can be a little more proactive and friendly towards Taiwan. But from an investor's perspective, these are intertwined. there's a lot of even managers who are required to run these Taiwanese factories many times might be Chinese nationals, because Taiwanese industry there, as Dr. Joe was saying, Taishan, if you look at the pockets in China like Kunshan, which is outside Shanghai, or in the Shenzhen area, a large number of industries run by Taiwanese depend on the Chinese workforce. So if someone were to set up a factory in India, it is Chinese nationals who might be, the managers of running these factories. The management might be Taiwanese. So these kind of linkages, it is very difficult for India to just break up all these linkages and say we want Taiwanese investment, but we don't want any linkages with China. So, that is a very tough sell. And so when we look at reducing dependency on China, we need to be very, very careful, or keep our expectations very moderate, saying that this is good. It gives an opportunity to do something better with Taiwan. But at the same time, it is not just sufficient to say we have to reduce dependency on China. We have to really make a case. And I think there might be some representatives of state governments who are listening to this webinar. A couple of states have really made outreach towards Taiwan. They have recruited Taiwanese consultants to help them reach out to Taiwanese companies. And I think it is important for them to bear in mind that they need to actually make a case that Taiwanese investments will be profitable in India. And that is the sort of prospect they have to hold out for. It is not a simple answer of giving incentives or, because the domestic production linked incentives are good as a sweetener. But there's so much more required to make a case for Taiwanese investments in India. I'll stop here. These are the policy level challenges. From a practical perspective, I will try to bring in a few more points if I get an opportunity later. Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you very much, Santosh. You covered a lot of ground over there. I see only one question in the chat box. So whilst others are coming in, let me pose one general question to all three of you. I think each of you has brought out in your own way the great scope that exists between Taiwan and India for greater trade and investment. But also the fact that Taiwan is deeply interlinked with the rest of East Asia, including mainland China. And if that constitutes a problem or an issue for India, then it is difficult to see how this is going to get off the ground. So are there any specific suggestions? Santosh has given several, but are there any specific suggestions that each of you can give in addition? If you limit yourself to 3 minutes, please, before we open it up, so that we can start creating the first steps towards an expanded economic as well as scientific, technological, people-to-people and cultural relationship. Thank you. Dr. Chen.
Okay. I want to say this. Actually, from Taiwan perspective, we have a very strong incentive to come into India to invest and also to have more trade over here. Because that Taiwan's economy right now, even you see earlier I showed Taiwan's figures of international trade, but we are becoming too dependent on the single Chinese market. Early this year, there's a figure released by Taiwan government that our export to China account for 43% of Taiwan's entire export. Yeah, so it's very, very high. Yeah, and in the past 30 years, Taiwanese companies already invested $188 billion to China. And you see how earlier I say that we only invested in India $1 or $2 billion in the past 20 years. And what can be done? I would make up 2 points. The first point is that right now Indian government's policies is to attract other companies to here to invest. And so they want Taiwanese companies to come here to invest. This is good because you want to develop your domestic, I would say, manufacture capacity. This is good. But before you get people to invest, I think that promoting trade is still necessary. Like a lot of Taiwanese companies, even if they come here to invest, they still have to import parts and the machineries from outside. So right now, Indian government still raise some high tariff on a lot of the parts and raw materials imported to India. So this will be very disadvantageous for Taiwanese companies because compared to their production base in Vietnam, in Indonesia, or even China, that the production cost in India is very high because of the high tariff. And the second issue I want to say that since India already decided not to join the RCEP, and then Taiwan also have no chance to join RCEP, and Taiwan also have very few FTAs with other countries. So why not the two of us just talk and sign an FTA just between us? Yeah, if we don't, I think that perhaps in India that you don't really like the word FTA. You have your own political concerns, but we could also talk about a comprehensive economic agreement and include investment and including technology transfer, everything together become a big comprehensive agreement just between India and Taiwan. Yeah, I think this is timing. This is a good time for us to discuss the possibility of doing this. This is my two suggestions.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Joe, 3 minutes for you.
Right. Thank you. Your point about would China be a factor when we engage with Taiwan? We have to bear in mind a very obvious trend, which is the elephant in the room. Mumin referred to 40% plus of Taiwan's trade still being dependent on China. I must add that this is the case as far as the Democratic Progressive Party is concerned. This is now the DPP that is in power. But if you look at the KMT, the situation was even more interdependent. For the KMT, the strategy to sustaining Taiwan's economic growth has been to look at China as a destination for exports, as a destination for outbound FDI, and also a potential source for inward investment. The KMT sort of yielded quite reasonably impressive economic results. If you look at Taiwanese economic growth, it touched roughly about 10% under the KMT. So the China factor cannot simply be wished away. I just wanted to point out that in terms of whether it is the KMT, whether it is the DPP, the shift away from China is going to be very you raised. To add to that, when we look at an India-Taiwan partnership, it has to have an organic basis. It has to have some kind of a goal-driven or a positive approach. An India-Taiwan partnership cannot be built based on negative causation that, you have an issue with China and therefore we should become friends. We should become friends because we should become friends. And that is the only way we can ensure longevity and stickiness as far as this relationship is concerned. Now, why I say this is also in a way linked to the core political attitudes within Taiwan. And just let me briefly share a few statistics relating to the core political attitudes in Taiwan. Now, if you are able to follow the trends here on my screen, it is evident that as far as the number of people who identify themselves to be purely Taiwanese is concerned, you can see that the trend has been on the rise, particularly over the last couple of years. From 2018 onwards, it's been a rising trend. Before that, there was a slight dip as far as, it peaked probably in 2014, and subsequently after it dipped, it's only in the last 2 years that we see that a core Taiwanese identity seems to be picking up. But for a fact, if you look at a long-term trend, right from 1992, which is where the axis begins, if you look at the graph, it is evident that, there is this Taiwanese identity which has been steadfastly climbing up over the last quarter century. An important factor for this is that there is a demographic change which is happening in Taiwan. There are more old people, and the sooner that a younger generation of Taiwanese people replaces the elderly, the more they would identify themselves as purely Taiwanese. So very clearly, there are those trends as far as domestic identity formation is concerned, and also with regard to unification. This is again another bit of data which is taken from the National Chungcheong University surveys. And this particular graph, it basically shows how there's been a preference for some kind of an indefinite status quo in cross-strait relations. The only thing which is unique in this graph, apart from the fact that the Taiwanese, they want an indefinite status quo in cross-strait relations, is that it has shifted slightly. If you look at the last 2-3 years, from 2018 onwards, it's basically a shift towards maybe decide at a later date. So in terms of domestic audiences, the preference for an indefinite status quo in cross-strait relations cannot be missed. And I think here I'd like to cite an interesting study which was conducted recently. It is not my study, but it is a study that was conducted by Timothy Rich, Andy Dama, and 2 other scholars. This was based on a survey in Taiwan through the National Chungcheong Tashui in 2019. The respondents, they were asked 2 specific questions concerning India. And I'll just share this on your screens. The respondents were asked, Taiwan, should it increase ties with India? Now, and the second question was, Taiwan, should it increase ties with India even if it creates tension with China? These were the 2 questions, right? I'll just repeat. The first question that these scholars posed to the respondents was, should Taiwan increase ties with India? It's evident that DPP supporters, if you look at the bar diagram right at the middle, DPP supporters, they feel that Taiwan, yes, should increase ties with India. But when the DPP supporters were asked whether increasing ties with India should come at a cost if it creates greater tension with China, it's interesting that there was some kind of a decline in support, right? When the issue was framed in terms of tensions vis-a-vis China. If you look at the KMT, again, going back to the initial comments that I made, the KMT traditionally has been perceived to be much more engaging as far as economic relations are concerned with China. And therefore, a lot of KMT supporters were not as excited. If you look at the numbers, 44% of them, only they felt that, Taiwan should increase ties with China. And when the proposition was that the ties with India should be improved at the cost of China, the support goes down. This is something that I want to again stress that, India needs to maintain that fine balance. At the end of the day, that balance will ensure that even if there is a deterioration in the relationship between China and Taiwan, at least the India segment of that relationship will not be unduly biased. And so to that extent, I think India should take up a more holistic approach at different levels instead of overstressing on simply the symbolic gains from stressing on more government-to-government relations. I think trust is built over a long period of time. I slightly tend to disagree with only the policy ecosystem being responsible. At the end of the day, Taiwanese SMEs are defined as SMEs when they have 40 million Taiwanese dollars. Indian SMEs are defined as Indian SMEs even if they have 25 lakh rupees to about 5 to 10 crore rupees. I mean, the classification of SMEs is no criterion. The fact of the matter is that we need more interaction, we need reiterated interaction. Dyads who've experienced closer economic partnership, even if you look at a problematic dyad like China and the United States, China and Japan, they have experienced further engendering of economic interdependence only through reiterated movement of people, more scholarships, more Japanese students studying in the United States, irrespective of the war history. So at the end of the day, it has to be more interaction, not less. Of course, the policy ecosystem needs to be responsive. And as both the scholars earlier were mentioning, I think Mumin specifically mentioned the high tariff barriers. All of those have to be addressed. But at the end of the day, we should befriend Taiwan because we want to befriend Taiwan and not for reasons of negative causation that are centered around China.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. I think you brought out a lot of very substantial points there. And I'm sure the audience will take that into account. Santosh, please
Yes.
remember we are close to coming to the last 15 minutes. So please keep your additional points very, very, very brief. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Ravi. I will only take 2-3 minutes and I will bring out 2-3 ideas to conclude. Before that, I just want to address what Dr. Joe was saying. Certainly, Taiwanese SMEs are not defined in the same way as Indian SMEs, but Taiwanese SMEs are they're characterized by a traditional business model where it's a family-owned business or it's a first or second generation entrepreneur who's making a decision rather than a large conglomerate or a multinational company or a SOE. So that is, the distinction I was trying to make. Now, from a practical perspective, there needs to be a lot of clarity to the Taiwanese. And I noticed a few journalists in the room. So in 2018, India and Taiwan signed a bilateral investment treaty. And I request everyone to read it because it is one of the only 4 or 5 BITs that India has signed under the new model. Because India started renewing all its BITs because it was felt that the old model was creating a lot of liabilities for the state. So under the new model, Taiwan is one of the few major economic players which has signed the BIT. And if you look at that, India has an obligation to make sure investments that come into India are sustainable and profitable. And everything that we have said today, erecting tariff barriers and so on, goes against that. So India needs to take a few more steps in furtherance of this BIT. So that's one action item, whether it is through assurances or confidence building measures and so on, that can be explored. The second part really is, what, again, Dr. Joe also mentioned, Taishangren. So the Taishang community in China and other places like Vietnam and so on is used to a very high level of convenience. So they're used to waking up in Shanghai, going to Shenzhen for lunch and going back to Taipei for dinner. So that kind of mobility, if it has to happen between India and Taiwan, we need a lot of flight links. We need absolute clarity on which is the best place. We can't have 5 states or 6 states competing for the same investment, for the same product. We need to tell the states, you focus on something else, or, let's give clarity to the foreign investor rather than having competitive diplomacy. Competitive diplomacy has a role. It has played its role in the last 6-7 years. But at some point of time, we need to give absolute clarity saying which is the best place for a particular product in India. So let's get on with the investment. And the last point I would like to make is this a whole separation of politics and economics tends to confuse the businessman. We need to have a clear messaging. And in the last 1 year, this has become even more blurred. Most Taiwanese companies have experiences in India going back to 10, 15, 20 years. We need to focus on giving them the confidence that the mistakes or the mishaps that have happened in the past cases. I don't want to take names, but there have been large Taiwanese groups which have retreated from India after making substantial investments and efforts. And even today, as we see the last few months, we have seen episodes, where the learning curve is very steep for Taiwanese companies. So we need to make a concerted effort, because success rate within, say, 100, 200 companies of 4 or 5 big players coming in is not too much. If we actually want to expand it to 500 companies, we need to make sure that there are many more successful cases in a short time, which gives more confidence to the rest of the community. So I just end it here, and maybe we can move on to the questions. Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you, Santosh. We are really short of time now. I see there are 3 questions in the chat box. So I'm going to read out 2 of them, which are very short. The third question from Saranya. I will request Saranya, while we are dealing with the other 2 questions, please compress your question into a short format, and I will come back to you and you can ask it yourself. So the other 2 questions are from Colonel Sahai, that Taiwan is a Buddhist country, so can we not encourage Buddhist pilgrimage to India from Taiwan? And the second question is from Arfina Hussain, who says, apart from friendly economic relations, can India and Taiwan bilateral ties can be seen from India's perspective as giving road bumps to China's expansionism policy in the South China Sea and also in the Indian Pacific? I've read the question exactly as it is. So now, let me come back to Saranya, and if I will just unmute you, Saranya, and make your question very crisp, please.
Hello, good evening, sir. My question is that with the government, especially the government of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, they have been trying to attract investment, and government of India is also trying to attract FDI in telecom sector, and especially in the semiconductors and electronics. Do you think Taiwanese companies will set up manufacturing plants in India in the near future?
Semiconductor.
Thank you, Saranya. Now, let me go in reverse order, and we are now at 10 past 4. So, just another 2-3 minutes. There are 3 questions. Choose 1, 2, or if you want to bash at all 3, do so. But remember, your limit is 3 minutes. Santosh.
Thank you, Ravi. I'll take the last question from Saranya. I think, as I mentioned earlier, semiconductor industry is a national treasure for Taiwan. And Taiwan, I think, has very close ties on collaborating in the semiconductor industry with its chosen strategic partners. While India does aspire to be one such partner, I think we have to start much smaller. We need to get, as Dr. Chen was referring to, a wide ecosystem of Taiwanese companies comfortable in India, both on the trading front and as investors who are making sustainable profits in India for a period, a long period before semiconductor investments can be considered. But even beyond Taiwan, semiconductor industry requires a lot of infrastructure support. Today, I don't believe India, any part of India, even the best performing FDI destinations in India, I don't believe they actually deliver on those fronts. So it's a bit of both question. India needs to do much more to attract such investments. And with Taiwan as well, we need to cover a lot of ground before we can talk about things like semiconductors. So I think that will be my response to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Santosh. Joe?
Yeah. I think in terms of concrete examples, Arfina, posed that question. No, sorry.
Yeah, Arfina posed the question.
Yeah.
Yes.
In terms of concrete examples, Saranya, I mean, there are some joint ventures which are there in the pipeline. So you have e-commerce giants like Amazon, who are now increasingly planning to collaborate with Taiwanese companies like Honhai, for instance. Somebody mentioned Pegotron. That's a huge iPhone assembler. They are sort of looking at India in a big way. A high-tech belt that connects Indian firms and Taiwanese firms is not beyond reach. The reason I say this is investment ecosystems, investment climate. This is not something that comes up overnight. It is not like saying that, the Taiwanese right now are investing in China. Why don't they simply come here? It's not that simple. I think it's important to understand that we need to do our homework and make sure that the investment climate is ready for these investors to come. They feel confident to come. I mean, at the end of the day, you're looking at serious political differences, and yet a lot of these investors not willing to come. So there has to be some reason why they are still willing to sort of, despite the hostility with China, they're still willing to do work there and yet not come here. So we have to be very practical in terms of the changes that need to be made here. It's also important, I think, I mean, of course, I am not very well placed to say this, but as an opinion, I feel that a relationship of permanent hostility does not augur well for any of these economies. At the end of the day, you go to China based on certain comparative advantages relating to labor that exists there. You deal with another country in terms of investments based on something else as far as comparative advantage is concerned. Companies, unlike traditionally, right now are not rushing to countries which offer cheap labor. Companies come to India because we have a huge consumer base. They can set up plants here. That is the number one reason for them to come here. They can service a middle class, which is roughly about 300 million plus. So if companies have to come here, there is a completely different economic dynamic that brings them here. But the question is, do we have the right investment climate and the ecosystem that can encourage companies to come here? Taiwanese companies, despite the hostility, are willing to go there. But despite whatever we've been saying, the number doesn't go beyond 1 billion here. And the number is 30 billion in Vietnam. So there has to be some kind of introspection done very realistically. And we need to cultivate the partnership based on iteration of multi-level engagement at all levels instead of some fixation with only government-to-government ties. So I would just leave it at that.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Joe. Dr. Chen, you have the last word in this seminar. And just now I see some more questions have come which relate also to education and whether we can expand educational ties with Taiwan. And so you might like to add that to whatever you want to say in your concluding.
I try to cover different things in short time.
First, 3 minutes, please.
About tourism. Actually, before the COVID-19, every year that about 30,000 Taiwanese tourists come to Delhi, come to India. This is a very, very small number. And among them, actually, a majority are actually Buddhist pilgrims. So actually, Buddhist pilgrims group already came to India. But if you want more Taiwanese tourists to come to India, Buddhism is not enough. India has a lot to offer. Yoga, food, and you have a lot of wildlife, national parks, and a lot of ancient, historical sites. So try to do some promotion in Taiwan. Japan, Korea, and many Southeast Asian countries, they do a lot of tourist promotion in Taiwan. And so I think there will be a better strategy to encourage Taiwanese tourists to come to India. And in terms of education, right now, already 3,000 Indian students studying in Taiwan, degree-seeking students. And this is a huge number because the number is actually higher than Indian students studying in Korea. Yeah, and among them, about 1/3, more than 1,000 are studying PhD, making Indian students the largest number, the largest group of PhD students in Taiwan from a single country. And so this education cooperation already there. But right now, most of the Taiwanese university one is to have more cooperation with the Indian universities. So in the future, not just attract Indian students to Taiwan, but also to have a joint programs, joint degrees with the Indian universities. I think this will be the next step. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the Taiwanese investment in India. Right now, most of the Taiwanese companies, they focus on a number of places. Many go to the South India. They are in Tamil Nadu, Chennai, and Andhra Pradesh. This is one area they concentrating in. And second is Bengaluru area because of high tech. And third is Delhi and surrounding areas. And the fourth is Gujarat. There are a lot of Taiwanese investment in Gujarat. So because India is very big, Taiwan actually, when they come to India, they will see where early Taiwanese companies already there. So I think that in future, Taiwanese companies will probably choose to go to those areas that already have some Taiwanese investment already been there. So I think that India also had to try to find some ways to attract Taiwanese companies to come here in future, and not saying that India is you can come anywhere. You have to find certain areas which is more attractive to Taiwanese companies in future. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. I think what this very rich discussion to me has revealed is that Taiwan, although a very small area, the size of Haryana, as you pointed out, Dr. Chen, which is where I live incidentally, and population is also about the same as Taiwan in Haryana. So Taiwan may be small, but its footprint in terms of trade, exports, linkages with other countries is very large, as we've seen. And I think this tells us something about what is to be done if we have to expand our trade and investment and grow very rapidly. Very valuable suggestions have come out of this particular discussion from all our three eminent panelists. And I think at the end of the day, it is some reflection that we in India have to do in terms of looking at this whole matter in a much more holistic light. I think holistic was the word Joe used, and I think that is the way to really look at it. There are some more questions, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. I do hope that those in policy-making circles have been listening in to this program, and that the valuable suggestions that have been made will find a place so that India and Taiwan, and indeed the whole region, can be economically, culturally, and otherwise closer together for the mutual benefit of all. So now it only remains for me to thank all our three panelists and the audience for participating in this very stimulating discussion. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chen.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Louisa, and also